step out of the modern world and into the quiet embrace of the ancients. Tonight, we drift through the silent corridors of history, from the sun-drenched stones of the Sahara to the cool, echoing chambers hidden beneath the earth. Let the weight of time ground you as we explore the stillness of these sacred places. Close your eyes, breathe, and travel back. The wind across the Sahara does not blow, it remembers. It remembers when the dunes were grass, when the emptiness was a lake, and when the sky was not a dome of indifferent blue, but a map etched in fire, read by people who walked with the stars in their eyes. This is the memory the wind carries from a place the Bedouin call Nabta Playa, a whisper of stone in the vastness of the Nubian desert, south of what would one day be the Nile's Great Valley. It is a story not written on papyrus, but laid upon the earth in circles and lines. A story told in granite and alignment, in the silent language of the first astronomers. Our story begins not with a king, but with a child. Her name is Aya, which means miracle. In the tongue of her people, a tongue now lost to all but the wind and the stones. She was born in the season of the long rain, when the playa, a vast flat basin, became a mirror for the sky, a shallow lake that drew the herds of wild aurochs and the careful humped cattle herded by her people. They were not settlers of stone cities, but navigators of seasons, their lives a slow, sacred dance of transhumance, following the grass and the water dictated by the heavens. Aya's grandfather, Anu, was the star watcher. His face was a landscape of wrinkles, each one said to have been carved by a different constellation. At night, by the dung fire's glow, he would point a bony finger at the shimmering expanse. "See there, little reed," he would say, his voice like sand sliding over rock. "Those are not just sparks. They are the campfires of our ancestors." He taught her the practical magic of their world. A line of 3 cairns might point to a distant waterhole only visible when the star Sa, which we call Orion's belt, rose just above them. Their entire annual migration, the movement of their precious cattle from the drying playa to the distant highlands and back, was a celestial choreography. The heliacal rising of Sepdet, the star we know as Sirius, signaled the end of the rainy season and the time to move east before the lakebed became a blinding, cracked plain. "But the greatest sign," Anu would whisper, drawing her close as the embers died, "is at the heart of the playa." They came down in the time before time. And with hands of light and shadow, they laid down stones in the pattern of the sky's turning. They built a clock of rock to teach us the secrets of the sun's return and the depth of the rains. Aya felt it as a summons. She would slip away from the skin tents, her feet silent on the cool, damp clay of the playa's edge, and stare towards the basin's center. By day, it was a haze of heat and light. One evening, on the cusp of her womanhood ceremony, the air changed. The sky was a black velvet cloth pierced with infinite diamond needles. Anu emerged from his tent, his usual calm replaced by a fierce intensity. He looked not at the sky, but at the horizon where the sun had vanished. The heavens hold their breath. It is time to go to the circle. The ceremonial journey to the central stone circle was made only once a generation for a girl coming of age who showed the sight. Aya's mother clasped her shoulders, her eyes bright with tears and pride. They set out on foot, the entire community, a silent procession across the silver-lit playa. The only sounds were the soft lowing of the ritual cattle chosen for the offering, the shuffle of feet, and the occasional chink of a water gourd. They walked for hours, the world reduced to flat earth and towering sky. Then shapes began to resolve from the darkness. Not hills, but stones. First, isolated monoliths taller than a person standing sentinel. Then, as they drew closer, the pattern revealed itself. Aya's breath caught. There was a central circle, perhaps 10 paces across, made of smaller, close-set stones. From it, like spokes from a hub or rays from a star, lines of stones radiated outward. Other stones lay in clusters, some flat like tables, others set in pairs. It was not chaotic. It felt intentional, a conversation between Earth and cosmos. The star clock, Anu said, his voice filled with reverence. He led Aya to the center of the circle. The community formed a ring around the periphery, their dark forms blending with the stones. The ritual cattle were led to a specific point just outside the main circle, where a shallow, man-made depression waited. This was a cattle burial pit, a tradition seen in the archaeological record of Nabta Playa. Anu began the chant, a low, rhythmic sound that seemed to vibrate from his chest into the ground. It was a calling to the star ancestors, a recitation of the lineage of watchers. As he chanted, he guided Aya's gaze along one of the stone lines. "This arm," he intoned, "points to the place where the sun is born on the longest day." This one greets the birth of Septet, the bringer of the flood. Each line was a calendar, an alarm clock of stone set millennia ago. The climax of the night approached. He placed her hands upon its sun-warmed surface, now cooling under the night. Do not look with your eyes alone, Aya. Look with your blood. Listen with your bones. The community fell completely silent. Even the cattle were still. Aya closed her eyes. She felt the vastness of the desert around her, the immense age of the stones beneath her palms, the cold, watching eternity of the stars above. And then, in that void of sound, she heard it. Not a voice, but a knowing, a geometry of light. Her mind's eye saw it. People, not so different from her own, but in a time when the grass was taller and the lake deeper. She saw them hauling these immense slabs of quarried sandstone on sledges and rollers, not with slaves, but with a unified, sacred purpose. She saw them observing year after year, generation after generation, marking a post, watching a shadow, noting the exact point on the horizon where a certain star first flickered into dawn's twilight. She saw the precision of their intent. These lines were not symbolic, they were functional. They marked the solstices and the equinoxes with astonishing accuracy, creating a calendar that could predict the coming of the vital rains. The stone calendar circle with its sightlines was a practical tool for survival, enshrined in ritual. It was not mythology separate from science. It was science born from and sustained by sacred myth. The star ancestors were not aliens, but the deified memory of the first discoverers of these celestial rhythms. The ritual was the technology's heartbeat. Aya opened her eyes. The stars had wheeled imperceptibly. The ceremony continued with the cattle offering, a solemn, grateful release of life back to the earth from which the herd sprang, its body oriented to mirror a celestial pattern. It was an act of symbiotic magic, ensuring the cycle would continue. As dawn's first blush tinged the eastern sky, painting the stones in hues of rose and ochre, something miraculous happened. Anu led Aya to the easternmost radial line of stones. They stood together, the old watcher and the new. The exact center stone of the circle behind them acted as a foresight. They looked down the line of outlying stones, a gun sight aimed at the horizon. As the sun's first blinding sliver appeared, it rose precisely over the farthest stone in the alignment. A dagger of light shot down the stone corridor, illuminating the path at their feet, and for a fleeting second, touched the central stone where Aya had stood. It was the solstice. You see, Anu said softly, the golden light etching his smile. You are now their voice. The community erupted in soft ululations and the gentle beat of hands on hide drums. Aya was no longer just a girl, she was the new Star Watcher. She spent the following years learning the full depth of the clock. She mapped the more mysterious gateway, stones, and cyst-like structures that, as archaeology would later suggest, may have represented constellations or served as symbolic markers for cosmic concepts far beyond simple solar observation. The entire playa was a sprawling, three-dimensional model of their cosmos. The story the stones tell is not one of eternal triumph, but of profound adaptation. As the centuries passed, Aya grew old, her own face becoming a map of the sky. And the skies began to withhold their bounty. The lake in the playa shrank season by season, leaving behind thicker crusts of salt and wider margins of cracked earth. The grass retreated. The great seasonal dance of transhumance stretched further, became more desperate. Aya, now the elder, watched the slow drying of her world. She stood at the stone circle under a pitiless sun, the alignments still true, the clock still perfect. But the reality it once predicted. The great migration of her people was no longer a circular dance, but an exodus. With a heavy heart, guided by the very stellar knowledge forged in this place, she led her people eastward, towards the one permanent river they knew only from traders' tales, the Nile. They took their cattle, their knowledge of animal husbandry, their pottery, and most importantly, they took the cosmic order in their minds. They carried the blueprint of Nabta Playa within them. The last night at the circle was one of quiet grief and powerful ritual. They did not bury cattle this time. Instead, they made a final offering of memory. They placed specially chosen stones, one for each family, at the foot of the central monoliths. Aya chanted the full history of the alignments, the names of all the star watchers, imprinting the story onto the wind and the waiting rock. "We are not abandoning you," she whispered to the stones. "We are planting you. You will sleep here, under the sun and stars, until the world needs to read the sky again." Then they turned their backs on the cradle of their science and walked into the dawn, following the star path that led to the river. Centuries turned to millennia. The desert claimed the playa utterly. The sands blew, covering and uncovering the stones. The great civilization of the pharaohs rose in the Nile Valley, building pyramids that echoed the monumental scale and celestial precision of those first humble stone alignments. Scholars would long debate the origins of Egyptian astronomy, of their solar calendar, of their obsession with the afterlife in the stars. They seldom looked to the empty desert to the west. The wind remembered. And sometimes a Bedouin traveler navigating by cairn and star would pass the strange, exposed stones of Nabta Playa. They would call them Al-Janab, the giants or the thrones of the jinn. The stones slept, holding their perfect geometry through 5,000 years of silence. Then, in a different age, came people with new tools. Archaeologists, brushing away the sand, saw not just stones, but patterns. They mapped the alignments with theodolites and GPS. They calculated the azimuths and found the compelling, undeniable match with the solstitial sunrises of the 5th millennium BCE. They uncovered the cattle burials, the hearths, the tools. The world learned of Africa's Stonehenge, a site centuries older than its British counterpart, a testament to a sophisticated pastoral society that built the world's earliest known astronomical observatory. But the data points and academic papers capture only the skeleton of the truth. The real story is the one Aya knew. It is the story of human eyes first discerning order in the celestial chaos, not out of idle curiosity, but out of a desperate, beautiful need to survive, to predict, to belong to the universe. It is the story of myth and observation fusing into a single tool for life. The stone circle at Nabta Playa is not a monument to forgotten gods, but to the first spark of empirical wonder, lit not in a palace or a temple, but around a cattle herder's fire under the immense Saharan sky. Today, the wind still blows across the playa, hotter and drier now. The stones stand in their watchful silence. If you go there and stand in the center as Aya did, and wait for the dawn on the solstice, you will see the same alignment. The hands of the star ancestors still point true. They speak of a time when humans, faced with an immense and unpredictable world, chose not just to endure it, but to measure it, to learn its rhythms, and to inscribe their understanding into the very bones of the earth. It is a message of profound hope that our deepest knowledge is born from our connection to the world, and that even when we must walk away, the truth we carve in stone or carry in our hearts endures, waiting for the light to find it once more. Go. The air in Malta is thick with the scent of salt and sun-baked stone, a weight you carry with you from the glittering blue of the Mediterranean to the honey-colored streets of Paola. It is a land of whispers, this archipelago. The wind murmurs through the limestone fissures, the sea sighs against the cliffs, and beneath your feet, in the very bedrock of the island, the earth itself seems to hold its breath, guarding a secret. That secret is Hal Saflieni, the Hypogeum. It is not a ruin, not in the way we think of them, exposed, skeletal, open to the sky. This is a temple turned inward, a sacred space carved not up towards the heavens, but down into the silent, resonant heart of the world. They found it by accident in 1902, workers digging cisterns for a new housing development. Their picks broke through into nothingness, and a cool, ancient breath, smelling of wet clay and thyme, sighed out from the darkness. What they revealed was a labyrinth, a three-level descent into a Neolithic dream. But long before the archaeologists arrived with their measuring tapes and theories, the people of the islands knew. There were stories, passed from grandmother to grandchild, with the evening stories of a door in the earth that led to the world, before the world, a place where sound took shape and thought could be heard. This is the story of that place, woven from the echoes that still linger in its painted chambers and from the silent vigilance of the stone. To understand the Hypogeum, you must first understand the people who made it. They were the temple builders, a people who thrived on these islands over 5,000 years ago, a millennium before the pyramids of Giza pierced the Egyptian sky. They worshipped a goddess, a plump, sleeping figurine of clay or stone found in their temples. She was the earth, fertile and dreaming. Their world was one of limestone, soft enough to carve with stone and antler tools, yet enduring enough to last epochs. They built temples above ground, great complexes like Gantija on Gozo with massive corbelled walls. But at Hal Saflieni, they performed the ultimate act of reverence. They inverted the temple. They went down. The descent begins innocuously, a narrow staircase cut into the living rock. You are swallowed. The air changes instantly, cool, damp, carrying a mineral tang and that profound, age-old silence that is not an absence, but a presence. The walls, in the low light, are the color of old bone. Here are simple chambers, burial niches like stone wombs cut into the walls. But even here you feel it. The space is not random. The curves of the ceiling, the proportions of the doorways. You move deeper, down to the middle level. The architecture becomes grand, more ambitious. You enter the Holy of Holies, a room carved in meticulous imitation of the above-ground temples. Massive trilithon doorways are etched into the rock, pillars that support nothing but the idea of a roof. The ceiling is painted with spirals in red ochre, swirling hypnotic vortices that seem to drift and turn in the flicker of a torch. It is here that the first legend finds its home, the resonance vigil before the oracle's niche. In one wall of this sacred chamber is a small, elliptical opening, the oracle's niche. It is no larger than a human head. The tradition, whispered by the few guides who speak of such things, tells that on the nights of the solstice and equinox, when the world held its breath between seasons, a chosen one would be brought here. Not a priest or a chieftain, but often a child, or a woman who had not yet borne children. Someone whose mind was clear, a vessel unfilled. They would kneel before the niche in complete darkness, their face inches from the opening. Behind them, the community would gather, not to speak, It began with a single low note, a man's voice finding the fundamental tone of the chamber. Then another voice joined, a fifth above. Then more, weaving a slow droning chord that filled the stone room. The air would thicken, become palpable. The sound waves, shaped by the perfect curvature of the chamber, would focus through the oracle's niche like light through a lens. The chosen one, their forehead resting against the cool limestone, would not hear the sound with their ears. They would feel it vibrate through their skull, a pure internal resonance. In that state, between wakefulness and trance, the boundary between thought and sound would dissolve. Questions posed by the elders would not be answered with words, but with images, sensations, emotions that would flood the oracle's mind. Visions of weather patterns, the location of fish schools, the health of the community. It was not prophecy of kings and wars, but of survival, a sonar pulse sent into the fabric of the world, listening for the echo of what was to come. The science, when it came millennia later, would prove the acoustics were no accident. The chamber resonates at a frequency of 110 Hz, a low, visceral hum. Modern studies have shown that sustained exposure to this specific frequency can alter brainwave patterns, quieting the prefrontal cortex associated with ego and linear thought, and allowing other more diffuse and intuitive networks to fire. The builders knew nothing of Hertz, but they knew the effect. They carved the room to find that note, the Earth's own frequency, and they used it as a tool to open the mind. From the oracle chamber, a tight corridor leads you to the heart of the mystery, the so-called main chamber. It is a vast circular room, its dome hewn with astonishing symmetry. But its wonder is not just in its size. On the floor lies a deep, bell-shaped pit, and opposite it, high in the wall, is another small niche. This is the stage for the whispering choir of the deep well. The legend is simple, haunting, and persistent. Two people could stand at a distance, one speaking in a normal tone into the high niche, the other listening at the rim of the deep well. The words would travel, carried by the unique acoustics, not as sound through air, but almost as vibration through the stone itself, arriving at the listener's ear with supernatural clarity, as if the speaker stood right beside them. But the tradition says it was used for more than conversation. It is said that during times of great turmoil or before a long sea voyage, a ritual would be held. The community would gather in the main chamber. An elder, a keeper of stories, would ascend to the high niche. Below, by the well, the youngest infants of the community would be held in their mother's arms. The elder would not speak words, but would begin to chant a low, repetitive series of tones, a wordless song that was the sound memory of the people, the crash of winter waves, the wind in the summer barley, the call of the shearwater at dusk. This chant, projected into the niche, would be gathered by the stone and poured into the well, where it would rise up, purified and amplified, to wash over the children. It was a baptism of sound, an imprinting of the island's essence into their very bones, so that no matter where they roamed, the song of Malta would resonate within them, a homing beacon in the blood. You move deeper, down to the lowest level. Here, in a small, cell-like room, they performed the clay vessel humming ceremony. Dozens of these vessels, wide-bellied urns with small openings, have been found in the Hypogeum. History calls them burial jars, for they held the bones of the departed, placed in a fetal position after the flesh had decayed elsewhere. But the legend gives them a voice. The closest kin would take the empty vessel and, holding it to their lips, hum into its opening, finding the note that made the clay itself vibrate most strongly. Into this hum, they would pour their memories of the deceased. Not stories, but the feeling of the person, the warmth of their hand, the sound of their laughter, the particular way they looked at the sunrise. The hum, charged with this emotional resonance, was sealed within the jar with the bones. The jar was then placed in a niche. The belief was that the hum would sustain the essence of the departed, a low, eternal song in the darkness, keeping them company in the long sleep and preventing their spirit from becoming lost or restless. To stand in that lower chamber, surrounded by silent niches, is to feel surrounded not by dead silence, but by a choir of stilled songs, a library of muted hums holding the echoes of 5,000 souls. But the deepest ritual, the most profound and perilous, was the subterranean lullaby for dream-seeking. This was not a communal rite, but a solitary journey, undertaken only by those in unbearable grief, or those seeking a vision to guide the entire people through drought or plague. The seeker would be prepared for days with fasting and meditation. Then, led by a guide, they would descend to the lowest, most silent cell. There, they would lie upon a stone slab, and the guide would perform the echo-binding rite of the pillared hall. The guide would move to a specific chamber on the middle level. a room with elegant pillars carved from the rock. Standing in the precise center, they would begin to chant a complex rising and falling melody. The pillars and the curved walls would catch the chant, breaking it, multiplying it, creating a cascade of overlapping echoes that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere. This cascade of bound sound would be directed down the shaft to the lowest cell. To the seeker lying in absolute darkness, it did not sound like a chant. It became a swirling sonic vortex, a lullaby woven from pure echo. It would flood their senses, overwhelming sight and touch with sound, pulling their consciousness down below the level of ordinary dream into a state the legends call the unwaking. In this state, they would journey. The most blessed or cursed were said to have heard the goddess herself, not as a voice, but as a foundational tone, a vibration that explained the shape of the world. The seeker would remain in this trance for a day and a night. But they carried something back, a clarity, a knowing, or a peace that had been absent. The peril was that some never truly returned. Their minds remained entranced, captivated by the siren song of the stone, forever listening to the lullaby in the silence of their own skulls. The story of the Hypogeum does not end with the fading of the temple builders. Their civilization, so sophisticated and peaceful, vanished around 2500 BC. We do not know why. Famine, climate change, perhaps a new people arriving. But the island remembered. In Maltese folk tradition, right up to the modern era, there were tales of squofor holes that led to an underground palace where a sleeping queen ruled over silent stone people. People spoke of places where, if you put your ear to the ground on a quiet night, you could hear a faint musical humming. When it was rediscovered, the world was astounded. bones of over 7,000 individuals were removed, along with precious artifacts, their context lost forever. Then, in the 1940s, with the island under siege, the Hypogeum was used as an air raid shelter. The thunder of bombs echoed through chambers that had known only sacred chants. Later, when it was open to the public, visitors would sometimes report strange phenomena, a feeling of being watched, sudden temperature drops, an overwhelming sense of peace or dread. Most famously, there were accounts of people hearing distant choral singing in the deepest parts when no one else was present. Investigations found nothing. The management, to preserve the delicate microclimate and the sanity of their staff, now strictly limits entry, keeping the human breath and the modern world's noise to a minimum. Perhaps the most poignant reflection comes from the acoustics themselves. Modern musicians and researchers have been allowed to experiment. They have confirmed everything. When a singer holds a note in the oracle chamber, you do not just hear it, you feel it in your sternum, in your teeth. It becomes apparent that this was not a temple decorated with sound. It was a temple built from sound. The architecture is frozen music. The chambers are instruments, and the human voice was the breath that brought them to life, to commune with something vast and unseen. You emerge from the Hypogeum blinking, the Mediterranean sun feeling like a physical blow after the soft darkness. But you are not the same. You understand that the people of Neolithic Malta did not fear the dark beneath their feet. They revered it. They sought not to conquer the earth, but to listen to it. They carved an ear into the limestone and pressed their collective brow against it, listening for the heartbeat of the goddess, for the song of their own ancestors, for the faint, guiding echo from the future. The Hypogeum of Hal Saflieni stands as a testament not to the power of kings, but to the power of attention. In a world obsessed with speaking, with building upwards to shout our presence, they chose to go down, to be quiet, and to listen. They understood that the most profound communications are not made of words, but of vibrations. Their legacy is a whisper in the stone, a frequency that still hums below the streets and houses, a reminder that sometimes the way to find what is most sacred is not to reach for the sky, but to descend into the quiet, singing dark and listen for the echo of our own humanity, deep, deep within. Oh, by half. The mist that clung to the red soil of Zhejiang was old, older than the bamboo groves that whispered on the hillsides, older than the villages whose smoke curled into the damp air. It was a mist that remembered. In the quiet county of Longyou, not far from the serpentine bend of the Q River, the earth held a secret beneath its skin, a secret of stone, shadow, and sound. The locals spoke of it in lowered voices, especially after the last light bled from the sky. They called it Ait Dixia Shintana, the underground hall of the gods. For centuries, it was just a story, a waterlogged myth about a bottomless pool in Fenghuang Hill, a pool that never dried, even in the fiercest drought. The fish were said to be blind and wise. He wanted to see the bottom. What he and his neighbors found was no pool at all, but a man-made throat into the earth. When the last of the water gurgled away, revealing a giant carved staircase descending into blackness, the old stories woke up and began to breathe. This is not merely the story of that discovery, but of the deeper, older story the stones themselves tell. It is a story woven from the echo-mapping pilgrimage, the whispering groove procession, and the silent looms of sound that hang in the still air. The cavern revealed was not one, but eventually 36. Vast, cavernous halls, each the size of a palace atrium, hewn with impossible precision from the silty red sandstone. Pillars, squared and majestic, held up ceilings that soared into darkness. But it was the walls that stole the breath and confounded the mind. Every surface, from floor to ceiling, was covered in a uniform, parallel pattern of chisel marks, grooves about the width of a hand, running in straight, relentless lines. They were not haphazard, they were deliberate, a text written in a language of geometry and resonance. To run a hand along them was to feel a vibration, a latent hum, as if the stone was a frozen chord waiting to be struck. The air inside was cool, heavy, and tasted of ancient dust and damp clay. It did not feel like a tomb, a mine, or a storehouse. It felt like an instrument. Legends, of course, rushed in to fill the silence left by the receding waters. The oldest tale, whispered by the eldest grandmothers in nearby Xianbei village, spoke of the Chiyuk, the mythical rebel god and master of metals, warfare, and, significantly, mist. After his defeat by the Yellow Emperor, his scattered tribe, the Julish, were said to have fled to the southern wilds. Some believed they dug these halls as a refuge, a subterranean forge where they could hammer out their vengeance in secret. The grooves, they said, were not decorative. They were the tracks of the stone drakes, serpentine spirits of the deep earth that the stew-like tamed to carve the rock, their diamond-hard scales scraping these perfect lines as they writhed through solid stone. But a gentler, more poignant legend persisted among those who worked the land. This was the story of the Sound Weavers. It was said that in an age when the sky and earth were closer, when dragons still swam in the clouds and phoenixes nested in the peaks, humanity understood the fabric of reality, not as matter, but as vibration. A great sage king, perhaps a dim memory of Yu the Great who tamed the floods, knew that the land of Longyou was a nexus of silent terrestrial songs. The earth here sang, but its song was trapped, causing tremors and unstable waters. So he commanded the digging of these chambers. They were not dug with picks and shovels, but with song. They would hum a single pure note that, focused by the sage's wisdom, would soften the stone like butter, allowing it to be shaped by hand. The grooves were the fossilized remnants of these primal frequencies, carved to guide and amplify sound, to tune the chamber to a specific celestial pitch. This was the origin of stone loom sound. This legend birthed the most beautiful of the local traditions, the annual Echo Harvest. On the night of the Mid-Autumn Festival, when the moon was fullest and its light most potent, villagers would gather at the mouth of the largest cave. They would not enter, for the halls were considered sleeping. Instead, they would bring gifts of the season, perfect, round mooncakes, bowls of clear well water, and bundles of newly harvested rice. These were the chamber resonance offerings. She would sing a single rising note, a wordless aria that floated into the dark portal. And from the depths her note would return, but transformed. It would come back layered, deepened, woven with harmonics that were not in the original cry. It might sound like a chorus, or like the low thrum of a stone zither. This returning sound was the harvest. They believed it carried the wisdom and blessing of the stone, a sonic fertilizer for the spirit. The echoed note was captured. The historical truth, as archaeologists and geologists have since pieced together, is no less staggering. The Longyou Caves are a colossal, enigmatic feat of engineering dating back at least 2,000 years, possibly to the Western Han Dynasty, or even earlier. The volume of rock removed is estimated at nearly 1 million cubic meters. The precision is breathtaking. Walls meeting at perfect 90-degree angles, pillars evenly distributed to bear the immense weight, and those ubiquitous grooves covering an estimated 80% of all surfaces. The grooves, studies suggest, served multiple practical purposes. They increased surface area, which helped control acoustics and prevent echoes from becoming a deafening roar. Their uniform pattern is consistent with a specific, systematic quarrying technique, likely using a line of workers with standardized chisels moving in unison. Yet, the acoustic effect is undeniable. Speak in one of the central chambers, and your voice is carried with uncanny clarity to the far corners without distortion. Strike the stone in certain grooved spots, and it rings with a clear, bell-like tone, different from the dull thud of an unworked sandstone block. This marriage of legend and fact is most palpable during the Whispering Groove procession, a tradition that spontaneously arose after the cave's rediscovery and is now observed every spring. It is a secular ritual, a way for the modern community to interact with the wonder in their midst. One, the largest and first discovered. As they walk, they drag the stone gently along the parallel grooves on the wall. Swish, swish, swish. They become a rhythmic, whispering roar, like the breath of the mountain, or the distant rush of a subterranean river. The groove becomes a conduit, not just for sound, but for connection. Each participant feeling the vibration travel from the stone, up their arm, and into their bones. It is a tactile, collective meditation on the scale of time and human endeavor. The procession ends in the central chamber, where participants place their stones in a communal cairn, a new, silent offering to the old, speaking stone. Our story finds its heart in a young woman named Lin, a doctoral student in archaeoacoustics who grew up in Hangzhou, but whose grandmother hailed from Xianbei. Lin's childhood was filled with her grandmother's stories of the echo harvest and the sound weavers. For her, the caves were not a research subject first. They were a family heirloom, a living myth. Her thesis was on the acoustic properties of the grooves, but her soul was on a different kind of echo mapping pilgrimage. This was the personal journey many undertook, to enter the caves alone, with a question in their heart, and to listen not just for an echo, but for an answer. One still overcast afternoon, when the tourists had departed and the caretakers were at their gatehouse, Lynn secured special permission for an extended solitary study. She carried her digital recorder, her laser measurer, and her grandmother's old mooncake mold, a wooden press carved with a rabbit and moon pattern. The air inside cave number 1 was a presence. It was cooler than the outside, heavy and utterly still. The hum of the modern world vanished, replaced by the low thrum of her own blood in her ears. Her headlamp beam cut through the darkness, illuminating the majestic pillars and the relentless, beautiful grooves that covered every surface like the grain of some colossal piece of petrified wood. She set up her equipment near a pillar in the very center, the traditional singing spot of legend. She played a series of test tones from her speaker pure sine waves at different frequencies. The air vibrated palpably. Dust motes, illuminated in her headlamp, danced in sudden, frantic swirls. At 220 Hz, the returning echo from the far wall was not a decay, but a sustained, choir-like reinforcement. The grooves were acting as diffraction gratings for sound, breaking it up and scattering it in precise ways, creating standing waves that made certain spots feel charged and alive. The science was clear, measurable, and magnificent, yet it felt like she was merely reading the footnotes of a much grander text. Sitting on the cold stone floor, she switched off her equipment. The silence rushed back in, deeper and more profound than before. She thought of her grandmother, who had passed the previous winter. She thought of the old woman's voice, thin and reedy with age, singing a fragment of the harvest song. On an impulse, Lynn didn't sing. Instead, she took out the wooden mooncake mold and, gently, pressed its carved face against a flat section of grooved wall. She traced the pattern with her fingers. Then she leaned her forehead against the cool sandstone and whispered her question, a question not for science, but for the ghost of memory and love. Nenai, did you hear the mountains sing? She waited. There was no audible echo to her whisper. But then a sensation began, a subtle rising vibration in the stone against her skin. It was not a sound she heard with her ears, but a resonance she... It was rhythmic, wave-like. In her mind's ear, fueled by a lifetime of stories and the powerful suggestibility of the space, it resolved into something almost melodic, a deep, earthbound counterpart to her grandmother's high, clear note. A tear traced a warm path down her cool cheek. It was not an answer, but it was a connection, a resonance across time. In that moment, the legend of the sound weavers ceased to be a metaphor and became an experience. The cave wasn't just reflecting sound. The climax of the Longyou story is not a dramatic event, but a dawning realization, a collective understanding that bridges the gap between then and now. It occurred during a regional conference held in Longyou, where engineers, historians, archaeologists, and local custodians shared a stage. An acoustic physicist presented her data, showing how the groove depth and spacing correlated perfectly to dampen certain chaotic frequencies and enhance harmonic ones, creating an optimal environment for clear communal speech or chant. A historian then read from a fragmentary Tang Dynasty local gazetteer, which mentioned a subterranean hall of rectifying harmony, where local officials would gather in times of flood or quake to harmonize the keys of the land. Finally, old Mr. Chen, the keeper of the caves for 30 years, spoke. He had no slides or charts. "You all talk of frequencies and dynasties," he said, his voice roughened by years and the cave's damp air carried easily to the back of the hall. "The scientists measure the echo. Before the Whispering Groove procession, people were anxious. After it, they are calm. After it, we feel prepared. When people come here, they speak less and listen more. That is what the builders knew. They didn't build a temple or a tomb. They built a listening place. His words hung in the modern conference room with the same weight they might have in the caves. The disparate threads, the legend of the sound weavers tuning the earth's song, the historical record of a hall for rectifying harmony, the scientific proof of masterful acoustic design, and the living traditions of procession and harvest suddenly wove together into a coherent, stunning picture. The Longyou Caves were an ancient, monumental tool for social and perhaps spiritual cohesion. In a world before mass media, before even widespread literacy, what could be more powerful than a space that made the human voice clear, unified, and resonant? A space where a community could literally feel itself as part of a single, vibrating whole. The resolution is written not in stone, but in the soft, persistent patterns of ongoing life. Tourists walk the illuminated pathways, their gasps and whispers bouncing softly off the grooved walls in a new, polyglot chorus. Scientists continue their scans and measurements, adding new data to the mystery. The annual Echo Harvest is now a public cultural festival, drawing crowds. The singer's voice is amplified, but the ritual pause, the collective intake of breath waiting for the transformed echo, remains. The Whispering Groove procession is managed with timed tickets, but the profound shared silence and the collective swish, swish is managed with timed time. Lynn completed her thesis. Her measurements and analysis formed a key part of the scientific record. But in her conclusion, she included a personal postscript. She wrote of the E-Echo mapping pilgrimage. not as a legend, but as a human imperative. "We map echoes," she wrote, "not to find their source, but to find our place in the space between the sound and its return." The builders of Longyou carved a space for that in-between. They carved a space for listening. In our world of relentless noise and fragmented attention, that may be their most profound gift to us. A monumental reminder that before we speak, we must hear, and that true harmony is not the absence of sound, but the resonant order we create together. On her last visit before moving to take up a research post abroad, Lynn went to the caves at dusk. She did not enter. She stood outside, watching the swallows dart into their nests in the cliffs above the man-made entrance. She thought of the millions of strokes it took to create those grooves, the countless hands, the shared purpose lost to time. Yet, the purpose itself echoed forward. It was in the peace on Mr. Chen's face as he locked the gate. It was in the laughter of children playing a game of echo tag nearby. It was in the very soil of Longyou, which no longer trembled with uncertainty, but held a deep, resonant secret. The mist began to rise again from the red earth, as it always did. It curled around the hills, a silent, gentle echo of the water that once hid the caves. It remembered the chisels, the chants, the processions, and the whispered questions. And in the quiet heart of that mist, in the space between the breath of the land and the ear of the sky, the mountain still sang its low, patient, grooved song, waiting, always waiting, for the next generation of listeners to come and weave their own sound into its everlasting loom. And knowing the air in the Cordillera Blanca is thin and sharp, a crystalline cold that seeps into the bones long before the first light gilds the snow-capped peaks. In this high valley, where the Mosna and Huachexa rivers converge, the earth itself seems to hold its breath. The mountains are not silent. They whisper of deep time, of glaciers grinding stone to dust, of rivers carving canyons with infinite patience. And in the heart of this whispering landscape, a temple rises, or rather, sinks into the belly of the world. It is not a palace in the sky like later Inca marvels. It is a root. A dark, tangled stone root driven into the Andean earth, designed not to reach for the heavens, but to channel the chaotic voices of the world below into a single, terrifying, transformative song. Our story begins not with kings, but with a boy named Waman. His name meant falcon, but he felt more like a field mouse, small and trembling, as he stood before the granite teeth of the old temple's entrance. He was 14 reigns old, and his hands, calloused from tending his father's alpaca herds on the high Puna, were slick with sweat. Today was the beginning of the Si Kwapak Remi. You will hear the voice of Wiracocha, the high priest, the Willak Umuus had intoned the night before, his face a mask of stern shadows in the firelight of the men's lodge. Not with your ears, but with your spirit. Now, in the gray pre-dawn, a priest with eyes like black obsidian bound, a strip of thick, undyed wool over Waman's eyes. The world vanished. Sounds amplified, the distant rush of the converging rivers, the sigh of the wind through the quinul's trees, the nervous shuffle of the other novices. Then, a sound that was not of this world. It swelled into a deep, mournful, resonant blast that seemed to bypass his ears entirely and vibrate the marrow of his bones. A trumpet made from a giant conch shell, Strombus galeatus, harvested from the warm waters 1,000 kilometers away, a sacred breath from another world blown into the heart of the mountains. Follow. A voice hissed in his ear. A hand shoved him forward. The legend, as the grandmothers tell it, says that the first priests of Chavín were not men, but beings who emerged from the sacred lakes, bearing the knowledge of sound and stone. They were led by a figure who was both man and jaguar, who could command the rivers to reverse flow and the mountains to echo with the voices of ancestors. They built not with mortar, but with resonance, aligning granite blocks so precisely that a whisper at the eastern gate could be heard as a clear sentence in the western gallery. They did not carve canals for water alone, but for sound, channeling the roar of subterranean streams and the sigh of the wind into a symphony of power. The temple was a living ear pressed to the chest of the earth, listening to its heartbeat, and a mouth to amplify its will. Historians and archaeologists, centuries later, would piece together a different, yet no less wondrous, truth. The Chavín culture, flourishing from around 900 to 200 BCE, was the first unifying ideological force in the Andes, a mother culture whose influence stretched from the desert coast to the dense jungle. The site itself is a masterpiece of hydroengineering and psychoacoustics. A complex network of stone canals runs beneath the temple, diverting water from the nearby rivers. During the rainy season, these channels would fill, and their flow would be manipulated by stone plugs and gates. But more crucially, these same canals acted as sonic conduits. The Pututua blast, sounded in certain courtyards, would travel through these damp stone tubes, emerging in distant chambers, distorted, deepened, multiplied. A single breath transformed into the chorus of gods. Waman knew none of this as theory. He knew it as terror. Blindfolded, he inched forward. The air changed, growing heavier, smelling of damp earth and something else. Ozone, like the scent after a lightning strike. The pututush sounded again, but this time it was different. It came from everywhere and nowhere. It seemed to bounce off the walls in front of him, then from a corridor to his left, then from directly beneath his feet. The sound was no longer a single note. It was a twisting, living thing, coiling around him. He stumbled, his hands scraping against the wall. The granite was not featureless. His fingertips traced deep, sinuous carvings. The curve of a serpent's body, the gaping jaws of a caiman. The Lanzón, the central deity, a 15-foot-tall blade of white granite carved into a snarling, part human, part feline figure, fangs bared, hair of serpents. It was said to be the axis of the world, driven into the deepest chamber of the temple, its roots drinking from the underworld rivers. The sound of the Pututua was its voice. A rush of water echoed loud and sudden to his right. He flinched. It was the canals, the hidden veins of the temple. The priests would be performing the canal dousing ceremony now. As the summer rains swelled the rivers, they would open specific gates, listening to the gurgle and rush of water through the labyrinth. A smooth, fast flow might signal the approval of the mountain gods, the Apusi, for the coming planting season. A choked, turbulent sound could warn of conflict or famine. The water's song was an oracle, read by those who knew its stone throat. But for Waman, the water was just another disorienting voice in the cacophony. He was lost. Panic, cold and metallic, rose in his throat. This was the test. To navigate the echoing path was to surrender the logic of the eyes, to trust the body to the will of the soundscape. It was to understand that space here was not linear, but acoustic. A step taken toward a sound might lead you away from its source, tricked by a cunningly angled wall or a hidden sound channel. He forced himself to stop, to breathe the thick, ancient air. He let the vibrations wash over him. And slowly, he began to feel the difference. The Pututu blast from the straight-ahead corridor had a hard, immediate edge. The one filtering up from a grate near his feet was muffled, womb-like. The one echoing from a side passage had a watery reverberation. It had passed through a chamber where the canals were near the surface. He turned toward the muffled upward sound. He took a step, then another. The floor leveled. The air grew slightly drier. The chaotic echoes resolved subtly into a more direct call. He walked for what felt like an age, his world, a universe of sound and cold stone. Then, the Pututu ceased. He stood in a small, square chamber, lit by the faint gray light filtering down a narrow ventilation shaft. Before him, set into the wall, was a stone head. Not the terrifying Lanzone, but a cabeza clava, a tenon head, its stone eyes staring blankly, its lips parted in a silent scream or song, moss and lichen clinging to its stylized features. It was a guardian. He had reached one of the inner sanctuaries. A priest stood there, an older man with a face like weathered leather. He held a small, carved cup. "You listened with your feet," the priest said, his voice a dry rustle. "Not your ears." This was the beginning of the lithic communion. The priest pressed Waman's forehead against the cold stone of the cabeza clava. The granite was shockingly cold, almost alive with a deep mineral chill. Then he offered the cup. Inside was a thick, dark infusion, smelling of bitter earth and faintly of flowers. A brew of the vilcach tree, perhaps, or the sacred San Pedro cactus, known to open the doors of perception. "Drink," the priest said, "and press your thoughts into the stone. The temple remembers. It remembers the fire that formed it, the ice that carved it, the hands that placed it here. Drink and hear its memory." The bitterness made him gag, but he swallowed it down. For a long moment, nothing happened. Then, a warmth began in his stomach, spreading outwards like a slow sunrise. The cold stone against his forehead seemed to soften, to grow warm in sympathy. He closed his eyes, and the visions came. He did not see with his eyes. He felt them as pulses in the stone, as patterns in the dark behind his eyelids. He felt the immense grinding pressure of mountains being born, the patient drip of water in a deep cave over millennia. Then, sharper images, not images. He heard the chanting, not in Quechua, but in an older, guttural tongue, a song to persuade the stone to accept its new place. He felt the collective focus, the will of hundreds of minds directed not by a tyrant, but by a shared vision, a desire to create a machine for speaking with the divine. This was the historical truth. filtered through the prism of sacred plants and ritual belief. The construction of Chavín was a monumental act of social and spiritual engineering. Without the wheel, without draft animals, using only stone, bronze, and wood tools, they moved massive stones, engineered perfect drainage, and created acoustic effects that modern scientists are still deciphering. The psychoactive rituals were the operating system for this spiritual computer. The temple, the drugs, the sound, it was all one integrated technology for achieving altered states, for facilitating what they believed was direct communion with the supernatural forces governing their world. Waman's journey merged with the greater ritual unfolding above. As the sun reached its zenith for the solstice, the great plaza of the new temple began to fill. The resonance feast was beginning. People had journeyed for weeks from distant valleys and coasts, bearing offerings, spondylus shells from the ocean, coca leaves from the jungles, feathers from tropical birds, textiles woven with patterns that told stories only initiates could read. The air hummed with a different energy now, not the intimate terror of the labyrinth, but the powerful, thrumming anticipation of a community about to witness a miracle. From his inner chamber, Waman, his senses still expanded from the lithic communion, could hear it as a vast, composite organism waking up. The murmur of thousands of voices was a river. The stamping of feet in ritual dance was a heartbeat. And then the priests began their symphony. It started with a single, deep pututush from the highest platform. Its sound rolled across the plaza, a physical wave that made the crowd gasp. Before it faded, another answered from the opposite corner of the complex, its tone slightly altered by the geometry of the courtyard. Then another and another, not in sequence, but in overlapping waves. The sound bounced off the high, flat walls of the temple, off the surrounding foothills, creating a reverberating echo that lasted for minutes, a sustained chord woven from conch shell breath. Then the priests opened the master water gates. A new sound joined the chorus, the roar of unleashed water. Not a flood, but a directed, powerful rush through the main ceremonial channels that ran openly along the edges of the plaza before disappearing into grates and tunnels. The sound was thunderous, primal. It mingled with the fading pututua echoes, creating a dissonant, awe-inspiring harmony. The breath of the sea and the voice of the mountain river, married in stone. For the people in the plaza, this was the apotheosis. The gods were speaking. The Apis of the snow peaks, the As Pachamama of the earth, and the distant sea god were all present in that cacophony of manipulated sound. They felt the vibrations in their chests, in their teeth. It was overwhelming, undeniable proof of the priest's power to mediate between the human and the divine. Dancers fell into trances, their movements becoming jerky, possessed. Others wept, overcome by the sensory onslaught. The world of mundane reality, the hunger, the cold, the tribal disputes, was washed away in that torrent of sacred noise. Below, he was not taken to the plaza, but deeper, down a narrow descending staircase that seemed to cut into the very foundations of the Andes. The sound from above was here a muffled, distant storm. Here, the only sounds were their footsteps, their breathing, and the ever-present faint trickle of water in the absolute dark. They emerged into a chamber that stole what was left of woman's breath. It was not large, but it was immense in its presence. In the flickering light of a single oil lamp held by the lead priest, the lanzon rose from the floor, piercing upward into the shadows of the ceiling. It was more terrifying, more beautiful than any description. The feline face snarled eternally, its eyes seeming to follow the light. One hand was raised, the other lowered, a pose of simultaneous giving and receiving. Stylized serpents cascaded from its head like hair, flowing down its body into the base, connecting it to the underworld. This was the climax, the still point of the turning world, the axis. Here, all the channels of sound and water met in concept, if not in physical fact. The temple breathes. It exhales the voice of the gods. He placed Waman's hands on the cold base of the lanzon. We do not control the gods, boy. We negotiate. They are our language. We create a storm of the senses so perfect, so overwhelming, that the boundaries between worlds grow thin, and in that thin place we can plead for rain, for sun, for balance. He turned his ancient eyes to Waman. Our ancestors built this place to impose a sacred order upon that chaos, to translate the rage of the mountain into a song we can learn from, to make the unpredictable predictable. In that moment, for Waman, the legend and the history fused into a single, luminous truth. The hidden channels were not just clever engineering, they were the tendons of a cosmic body. The pututu was not just a shell trumpet, it was the shared lung of the community, exhaling a prayer shaped by stone. The terrifying face of the lanzon was not a monster to be feared, but a portrait of the cosmos itself, fierce, balanced, demanding, and ultimately communicative. The resonance feast above would last for days, a sustained peak of communal ecstasy and reinforcement of the social order. But for Waman, the ritual was complete. He was led back through the twisting corridors, emerging into the late afternoon sun at a different exit, blinking like a newborn. The world outside, the green valley, the towering white peaks, the bustling plaza still humming with energy, looked the same, yet utterly transformed. He now knew what lay beneath its skin. He knew the song it could sing. Centuries would pass. The influence of Chavín would wane. New powers would rise in the Andes, the Moche, the Nazca, the Wari, and finally the Inca, who would look upon Chavín as a sacred place of origin. the temples would be abandoned, the galleries flooded with silt, the secrets of the sound channels forgotten, buried under landslides and time. The land zone would stand in its dark chamber, unheard, unknown, for over 1,000 years. But stone has a long memory. Even today, if you stand in the sunken circular plaza of Chavín, when the wind is right and the modern world is quiet, you might hear it. Not a pututua blast, not a roar of water, but a subtler echo. The archaeologists who unearthed the canals and mapped the galleries have given us the history. The local people, the Chavinos, still carry fragments of the legend stories of the Weeping Stone and the underground Jaguar. And in a way, the temple still performs its function. It takes the chaos of history, the rise and fall of empires, the noise of our modern theories, and channels it into a singular, resonant truth. We humans, in our essence, have always sought to build bridges between the seen and the unseen. We have used the tools at our disposal: stone, water, sound, sacred plants, to create spaces where the impossible feels momentarily tangible. Chavín de Huántar is not a ruin, it is a fossilized prayer, a permanent stone testament to the moment our ancestors first learned to make the earth itself sing back to them, to translate their fears and hopes into architecture, and to listen, heart in throat, for an answer in the echoing dark. The falcon boy woman is long dust, but the path he walked, the lesson he learned in that labyrinth of sound, still whispers on the wind. The air over the Tarxien fields come dawn held a particular quality of silence, a thick woolen quiet that seemed to press down on the dew-heavy clover and the low, crumbling limestone walls. It was a silence that remembered sound. To the farmers who had worked this land for generations, turning up strange worked stones with their plows, it was just the hush before the day's labor. But to old Manuel, who came each morning as the first bruise of light stained the eastern sky, it was a canvas. He would place his gnarled hands, palms flat, against the largest of the exposed uprights, a slab of Globigerina limestone pocked by time, but still bearing the faint, elegant spirals carved by hands millennia gone. He would close his eyes, and he would listen. But they left him to his ritual. For Manuel believed, as his father and his father's father had whispered, that these stones could sing. The story did not begin with Manuel, of course. It began in the deep time before writing, when Malta was not an island of parishes and festas, but a sacred heart in the middle of a wine-dark sea. The people who came here, from Sicily perhaps, or beyond, found a land of soft golden stone. It was a forgiving rock, easy to shape with stone and antler picks, yet durable enough to dream in. And dream they did. They dreamed in circles, in ellipses, in sweeping curves that mimicked the swell of a mother's hip. They built not for defense, but for reverence. The Tarxien complex, 3 temples woven together like a stone labyrinth, was their grandest chorus. The legend, as Manuel heard it from his nonna by the light of a single oil lamp, spoke of the master shaper, a figure known only as El Gianij Tal, Jebel, the singer of stone. Al Granij Tal. He was not a king, but a listener. Before a block was quarried from the great pits at Miska, he would press his ear to the living bedrock and tap it with a round, water-smoothed pebble of chert. Each stratum had its own voice, a deep, hollow groan from the lower beds, a brighter, sharper talk from the nearer surface stone. He could hear the music trapped within, the latent song waiting to be shaped and set free. The temples, his nonna would murmur, her voice as dry as time, are not just buildings. They are an instrument. A fixed instrument built into the very earth. The pillars are the pipes, the altars are the sounding boards, and the spiral carvings. She would trace a finger in the air. The historical truth, painstakingly pieced together by scholars with trowels and measuring tapes, tells us the Tarxien Temples were constructed between 3600 and 2500 BCE, the apex of Malta's mysterious temple period. The complex is a masterpiece of megalithic architecture, concave facades leading into cloverleaf-shaped chambers, walls built of meticulously fitted coralline limestone slabs, interiors adorned with the finest prehistoric spiral reliefs in Europe. There were altars, one famously with a carved depiction of a bull and a sow, and curious stone hemispheres that might have been used for oracular purposes. And there were the porthole doorways and the great stone spheres, now silent, that may have been used to roll the massive blocks into place. But the farmers of Tarxien and Old Manuel knew another truth. They knew about the sound. On this particular morning, the air was still and carried the salt tang of the nearby Mediterranean. Manuel, as was his tradition, had brought a small, leather-bound mallet, not of iron, but of hard, aged olive wood. He moved to a specific block in the central temple's south chamber, a slab that seemed no different from any other to the untrained eye. But at its base, smoothed by countless touches, was a shallow depression. Here, the temple builders had once poured libations. Not just water or wine, Manuel's legend said, but rainwater collected in the miskak tanks, water that had sung with the rhythm of the falling sky. It was poured to awaken the stone, to remind it of its liquid origins deep in the earth's memory. Manuel took a small clay vial from his pocket and trickled a few drops of well water into the depression. "Quum," he whispered in Maltese, "awake." He raised the mallet and struck. The sound was not loud. It did not echo in the modern sense. It was a low, resonant hum, a vibration that seemed to bloom from the stone itself and travel up through the soles of his feet rather than just through the air. It was a tone so deep it felt more like a pressure in the chest than a noise in the ear. It lingered, fading slowly as if seeping back into the ground. This was the test. A true lithophone block, a singing stone, would hold the note, would converse with the other stones around it. Manuel moved to another slab, this one carved with a processional frieze of what looked like goats. He closed his eyes again. In his mind, he was not an old man in a dusty archaeological site. He was an apprentice in the age of the Shapers. The boy Cordon knelt in the quarry dust, his ears ringing. The master shaper, a man whose skin was the color and texture of the limestone itself, had just tapped a freshly exposed seam. The sound was a pure, sweet pingag. "This one," the master said, his voice gravelly, This is for the dawn chamber. It will catch the first light and hold its note the longest. You hear the difference. This, he struck again, and the note hung in the hot air. This is a voice. Cordon's task was to learn the pitches. As the rough blocks were shaped with flint adzes and sanded smooth with abrasive sandstone, he would follow, tapping each one. He began to map the temple in his mind, not by sight, but by sound. The massive trilithon entrance to the first temple was a chord, 2 deep grounding notes from the uprights, and a surprising, almost tinkling chime from the colossal lintel that capped them. The historians would later marvel at the engineering, at how these people, without metal, lifted multi-ton blocks. Cordon's people knew it was about balance, about finding the stone's natural point of resonance, where it felt almost weightless to the chant of the moving crew. The work was sacred, synchronized to the heavens. The temple's axis was aligned, as modern surveys confirm, to the rising sun of the equinoxes. On those mornings, a shaft of light would pierce the main doorway and travel, like a slow golden finger, across the central corridor to illuminate the central altar. But the legend adds a layer of music to this astronomy. As the sun reached its peak on the longest day, a designated priest, or perhaps the master himself, would move through the chambers, striking specific stones in a precise order. A low hum from the earth. This was not a melody for human ears alone. It was a harmonic key, a sonic alignment meant to lock the temple's vibration with that of the sun, charging the very stones with the year's greatest power. It was a belief that resonated with the known archaeological finds of carved stone spheres and elaborate spirals, objects that may have symbolized celestial motion and the cyclical nature of life. The most solemn use of the temple's music was for the dead. In a side chamber where the ruins now show evidence of cremated remains, there stood a unique configuration of stones. A flat, slightly concave slab lay between two vertically set stones with precise notches in their tops. Archaeologists call it altars or a libation table. The legend gives it a name, Il Mikmar Tal Imgayodi. When a revered elder or a priestess died, their body prepared for burial with ochre and amulets, they would be laid upon this slab. Then, starting at the foot of the slab, they would play a slow, dirge-like sequence on the notched uprights which acted like the tuned bars of a giant xylophone. The sound, eerie and profound, would fill the chamber. The belief was that the vibrations, specific and guiding, would help loosen the spirit from its earthly coil and provide a resonant pathway for it to travel, following the sound out of the temple, towards the sea, and to the islands of the ancestors whispered to lie beyond the western horizon. The poured libations here were not just offerings, they were a final act of tuning, ensuring the stone conduit was open and clear. Back in the present, the sun had fully risen, bleaching the color from the land. Manuel's private dawn chant was over. Now the modern world intruded. A gate clanged and voices echoed. The first tourists of the day, led by a young, enthusiastic guide named Elisa. And note the exquisite spiral motifs, possibly symbols of eternal life, or the goddess's regenerative power, Elisa was saying, her voice bright and factual. The group, clutching cameras and sun hats, shuffled past Manuel, giving the old man with the mallet a wide, slightly puzzled berth. One man, however, lingered. He was older, with a thoughtful face and hands that looked used to careful work. He was a geologist from Germany, here on a private pilgrimage of his own. He had read the speculative papers about megalithic acoustics, about lithophones in Karnak and Stonehenge. He watched Manuel. "Excuse me," the geologist said in careful English. "What are you doing?" Manuel looked up, his eyes milky with cataracts but sharp with intelligence. listening, he said simply, to the stones, to what is left in them. He pulled a small reflex hammer from his bag, a tool for testing mineral hardness. May I? The geologist tapped the same stone Manuel had awakened. He heard the hum, but his trained mind quantified it. Could induce a mild trance state if sustained. He moved to the goat stone, a higher pitch, clearer. The frequency range often associated with ritual chanting. The Globigerina limestone here, it's porous. It has a unique density and internal structure. If shaped correctly, with specific thicknesses and supported at certain nodes, they could have functioned as a deliberate idiophonic array. He was speaking history and physics now, but it was weaving seamlessly into Manuel's legend. They were not just stones, Manuel said, his voice gaining strength. They were the notes. They are not just pictures. They are the shape of the sound. The academic in him resisted, but the human in him, the one who felt the odd pressure in his chest from the low hum, understood. He saw the temple anew, not as a static plan in an archaeology textbook, but as a frozen symphony. The porthole doors weren't just architectural quirks. They could be sound baffles or waveguides. The famous fat lady statues with their voluminous skirts might not just be deities, but symbolic representations of sound waves emanating from a source. Elisa's tour group circled back. She was now explaining the funeral altar. The German geologist stood up. Intrigued, Elisa agreed. He took his hammer and, following an intuition that felt like a memory, struck the left notched upright of the altar slab. A clear, mournful tone rang out. He struck the right one. A tone, a perfect fifth higher. A gasp went through the small crowd. The sound was undeniable, musical, and utterly haunting in that ancient space. He didn't play a dirge. He didn't know it. But in the silence that followed the two notes, heavy with implication, the legend Manuel carried seemed to flood the chamber. They all felt it. The climax of the old story, the one Nonna told on nights when the wind whistled through the fissures in the family's own limestone farmhouse, was not one of triumph, but of silence. The singer of stone grew old. His hands grew shaky. He trained a new apprentice, a girl with keen ears named Tau Irku, for her eyes were like round, dark pools. She learned the pitches, the sequences, the libation prayers. But times were changing. The climate was turning drier, resources strained. Strangers came in different boats, a new people who worshipped gods of the sky and the spear, who built not temples of communion, but fortresses of dominion. The last great ceremony at Tarxien was a funeral, not for a person, but for the song itself. Knowing the end was near, the master shaper gathered the remaining keepers of the knowledge. Under a moonless night, they performed the full solstice sequence for the last time. Starting at the easternmost stone, they moved through the chambers, waking each tonal block. The air, it is said, grew thick and shimmered, not with heat, but with layered sound. When the final note from the great central trilithon faded, he took a hammer of sacred oak and, with a tear cutting a path through the dust on his cheek, he struck a fatal flaw into the keystone of the dawn chamber's most resonant arch. Not to destroy it, but to mute it. To put the great instrument to sleep so its song could not be defiled by hands that would not understand. The song is not gone, Manuel's nonna would conclude, the lamp guttering low. It has gone into the stone's dream, and the stone dreams slowly. It is waiting for the right listener, for the right dawn. As the tour group moved on, chattering excitedly about the musical stones, the German geologist stayed behind with Manuel. The old man was sitting on a low wall, looking tired but peaceful. But to hear the song that takes a lifetime of listening. from the silence in between. But it is not the same as knowing their soul. He took a final look around the temple complex. The rising sun now illuminated the spirals on the central stones, making them seem for a moment like ripples on a pond recently disturbed. He thought of the libations, the alignments, the funeral dirges. The historical record showed a sophisticated, peaceful society that vanished mysteriously. Perhaps their greatest technology wasn't in moving stone, but in understanding it, in weaving architecture, astronomy, and acoustics into a tool for touching the divine, for navigating death, for harmonizing community with cosmos. He offered a hand to help Manuel up. The old man took it, his grip still strong. Together, they walked slowly out of the temple complex. Behind them, the stones of Tarxien stood silent once more under the Maltese sun. They were ruins, yes. A puzzle for archaeologists, a wonder for tourists. The carved bulls and spirals spoke of a forgotten religion. The altars hinted at solemn rites. But if you go there very early, when the world is hushed and the light is new, place your hand flat on the sun-warmed limestone. Close your eyes. Don't just look. Listen. It is the echo of a solstice chord, the shadow of a guiding dirge, the dream of a song that once tuned an entire people to the rhythm of the earth and the sky. The instrument is silent, but it is not broken. It is only waiting, deep in its stone dream, for the next age of listeners.